Mike Winger's point number 2 differs between the two lists he produces on his video asserting that Psalm 22 is prophetic regarding the passion narrative of Jesus. But because he actually covers one of his point 2s in a point 3, I wanted to respond to that unique point 2 in this video. As part of that response, I'd like to relate a story. When I was in the 8th grade, I had just moved to a new school in a new state and had left all my friends behind, hundreds of miles away, and I was feeling rather lonely and sorry for myself. One day, while out on the playground of the school, I looked up and noticed these seagulls flying around, and while I was watching them, one of them dropped something. I ran over to see what it was, and it turned out to be a little brown leaf. I was immediately struck with the thought that this was some sort of sign. It was God's way of letting me know that everything was going to be all right. God had sent this special seagull to deliver a message to me, and all I needed was the faith to properly interpret what had happened. Well, I took that leaf home after school and made a special box for it, lined with some of my mom's cotton balls. I had kept that leaf for quite some time, and as a matter of fact, it may be somewhere in my box of memories up in the attic. I don't know. Looking back, I understand why I infused such meaning into the little leaf. I was feeling pretty sorry for myself and looking for anything to help me feel better and connected to someone or something. I was also a very superstitious and religious kid at the time, who saw God acting in pretty much every event of my life. It's not surprising at all that I would have seen that leaf as some sort of symbol. Seagulls don't drop leaves next to me every day. It must have had some sort of meaning. Now what probably really happened is, it was a school, and some of us used to eat our lunches outside on this grassy knoll out in the quad near the cafeteria, pretty close to where I was standing on the playground. These seagulls had likely been around looking for leftovers, any tidbits kids might have dropped on the ground or thrown in the open trash cans. This particular gull, my so-called messenger from the Lord, had probably picked up this leaf thinking it was a potato chip or something, but once it realized what it was, dropped it in mid-flight near where I was standing. So the leaf was just simply a leaf, and the seagull was just a seagull. Any meaning they had was put there by me in my religiously soaked mind. Now what does this have to do with Mike's second point? In his video, he does say this isn't 100% proof of anything, he just happens to find it interesting. Well, anything an apologist finds interesting indeed morphs into a proof of what they're arguing, whether they want to admit it or not. Else why did it land on Mike's list of points of comparison between Psalm 22 and the passion narratives of Jesus? Apologists aren't anything if not self-deluded. Mike draws his audience's attention to verse 6 of the psalm, where it is written, "I am a worm and not a man." And understand that this is not Mike's own invention here. Like Bob Duco, Mike is taking his lead from other apologists who have incestuously shared these apologetic gems among themselves for generations. What this apologetic does is note that the Hebrew word for worm in the verse is Tola, and this is apparently a very special little word. It translates into English as the Kermes worm or the crimson worm. What this is an insect that lives in the Mediterranean and was used by the ancients, Greeks, Romans, and the Israelites, to dye fabric red. So that's where it got its name. The female worm produces this red dye in both her body and her eggs. According to Mike, this worm attaches itself to an oak tree, laden with all these eggs within its body, or being protected by it, and if you try to move the worm, you'll crush it, releasing the dye and leaving behind a red stain. How much like Jesus this is! Jesus, affixed to a wooden cross, much like an oak tree, protects his followers by shedding his blood. Of course, the apologist misses the details here, like the fact that this is a female worm, and if you crush its body while the eggs are inside, you'll equally crush and destroy them as well. Squishing the dye out does not protect the eggs, and the reason the worm is attached to the oak tree is because the tree's sap is its source of food. It doesn't go there to die for its offspring. It also cannot move, given that in the insect's adult stage, it has lost its legs, its means of locomotion, as well as its eyes. It's blind. You may now begin to understand why I told you the earlier story about my seagull friend's leaf. The apologist is reading far too much into this word in verse 6 of Psalm 22, the way I read far too much into that leaf dropped on the playground back when I was in the 8th grade. One of the problems facing the apologist is the context of the verse in the psalm. We discussed in point 1 that the author is feeling abandoned. Even though he has been faithful all his life and been a pious follower of Yahweh, he is nonetheless feeling at the end of his rope, having been feeling this abandonment for a prolonged period of time, by day and by night, and is now comparing himself with this worm as something to be dried and crushed and thrown away. He is lower than humanity. He is not a man. He is a worm. He's using this metaphor to describe how low he is feeling about himself in comparison with the rest of humanity. He is not comparing himself with the actual nature of this specific creature. Mike tries to stress his point by saying there are not many words in Hebrew for worm, so the author of the Psalm's specific choice of Tola must have been on purpose, and therefore must carry the meaning Christian apologists infuse into it. Tola does appear 7 other times in the Hebrew Scriptures, where it is translated as worm. It is more commonly translated as crimson or scarlet elsewhere. But in every instance of its use outside of Psalm 22, when translated as worm, it is in a negative connotation. It refers to something that is rotting or detestable. A good example is found in Isaiah 14:11. All your pomp has been brought down to the grave, along with the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you. So for the author of Psalm 22, who has been lamenting his lowly status, his forsakenness by God, the use of that word here makes a lot of sense, and not as a prophetic allusion to the passion of Jesus. He is comparing himself to this disgusting worm, feeling as though he is no longer even human. The only other time Tola is used in Scripture and associated with a person is in Isaiah 41:14. Here it is linked to Jacob as the people of Israel, and it's very clear from the context that the word again is being used in a negative connotation. The meaning is to picture Israel in a lowly state. So every other time this word is used in Scripture and meant in the sense of this Tola worm, it is used in a lowly negative sense. It is not used in an uplifting sense. There is nothing positive about this worm. In every other instance, it is used to denote something in a lowly state, as something rotting or debased. Given the use of Tola elsewhere in Scripture, why then conclude that it has some different meaning in Psalm 22? In fact, there's every reason to believe it is meant here, given the Psalm's native context, in the same negative connotation as everywhere else. The psalmist is describing himself in this lowly state, so a natural comparison would be with this worm, where everywhere else in Scripture it is used to describe something repulsive. The only reason it is given a different meaning in Psalm 22 is because it fits the Christian apologetic assertion that the psalm is a prophetic utterance about Jesus. At the close of the 19th century, psychoanalysis was an exciting new field of study. It contained a set of theories and techniques allowing a practitioner to delve into a subject's unconscious mind. Sigmund Freud, who established the practice, was one who was very fixated on symbols of the phallus and how these express themselves in a person's unconscious mind through dreams, hobbies, and habits. Things like cigarettes, pipes, cigars were often given this symbolic meaning of the phallus. It's not difficult to understand why. You would have something like a cigar, and it would be noted that it was long and cylindrical in shape. It had, when lit, a red tip, and it emitted a flowing white substance. So for the psychoanalyst like Freud, anyone who had a fixation with cigars, if you smoked them or had a dream about a cigar, it was somehow equated with a phallus. But as the saying goes, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and sometimes a leaf is just a leaf, and sometimes a worm is just a worm. Now, you wouldn't be able to go and convince my 8th grade self that that leaf was just a leaf dropped by a random gull, probably having mistaken it for a burnt potato chip. My superstitious self at the time infused meaning into that leaf and believed it was some sort of sign from God, something supernatural. Dare I say this is what's happening in the superstitious mind of the apologist when he reads Tola worm in Psalm 22. It can't be just a worm for them. They must filter it through their Christ-centered reading of everything in Scripture. And so the worm stops being a worm, as it's given in the context of Psalm 22 itself. It has to be the worm of the prophetic Psalm 22, as read by a Christian and applied to Jesus. And it's very difficult to change an apologist's mind about this, so I'm under no delusion thinking that my argumentation is going to convince them at all. The apologist is dripping with superstitious thought, with finding religious meaning in the mundane, with finding Jesus on every tree, in every cloud, on every piece of burnt toast. So it isn't at all surprising that they find Jesus in a worm. But for the rest of us, I think we can strike through Mike Winger's point number 2 in his comparison of Psalm 22 with the Passion of Christ.